Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India from 1950 to 1990s, today we will talk about education, science and technology during the period immediately after independence. And as all of us are aware that when India becomes independent in 1947, it was grappling with so many problems in those times, and the destruction of the Gurukul system by the British during the colonial period led to a lot of illiteracy among the Indians. And when India became independent, when we see the census data of 1941, we find that hardly 10 to 20% of the people, they were considered to be literate from the point of view of the census data. So we find that there was a lot of need in terms of providing education to the masses, and at the same time the developments in the science as well as technology were also needed, so that the task of economic development which had to be undertaken by the India after independence could be done in a very smooth manner. And the 200 years of colonial rule had created a lot of devastation in various fields, including agriculture, industry, and we do not find that much developments in science and technology or in education were made by British. And whatever developments they were made in the education sector, they were concerned primarily with the needs of the British, where they wanted to create educated Indians, those Indians who could work as clerks in the lower administrative levels. So the strategy of the British in that context was not fruitful to India in any concern, and Indians, they had to make a lot of effort after independence so that developments in educational sector and science and technology could be undertaken, so that India could be put on the path of development. And we see that and not only from the point of view of the school education, but at the level of universities and technical education, different kinds of efforts they were being made by the government, and the establishment of the IITs and IIMs, which became some sort of important brands during this period, was also undertaken. In the context of the references, you could refer to Bipin Chandra's India after Independence, Ramchandra Guha's India after Gandhi, B.L. Grover and Introduction to Modern India. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about the education as well as science and technology. And we also find that during the colonial period, different kinds of ideological positions, whether the utilitarians or Orientalists or evangelicals, all of them they were in favor of British ruling India. And if you see that there was Anglicist and Orientalist debate, where the Anglicists, they favored the English education, and both evangelicals and utilitarians, both of them, they wanted that English education should be given to the Indians. And people like Macaulay and James Mill, they thought that when this kind of an education will be provided to the Indians, then only the real education will be provided to them. And James Mill, he remarked that the great need should not have been to teach Hindu learning but useful learning. So he dismisses the former as obscure and worth less knowledge. So that was the prejudiced minds of the people, those who were at the helm of affairs, and this is what they thought about the Indian education system. And they believed that if they will provide thrust to the English education, then the British markets are going to benefit, because then Indians will develop that kind of an outlook where they will prefer the European products and European outlook. And when India becomes independent, they plan to go for the kind of ideals which they had during the national movement as well, and they wanted to do the things within the framework of the scientific and international outlook. And all this could be done in a framework of democracy, and the economic development should also be done not only with the framework of the capitalist kind of a setup, rather mixed economy was preferred during this time. And when we see the kind of challenges which were there in front of the Indians, then we find that there was no growth during this time, and poverty and unemployment they were there, and the land reforms which were initiated in certain states, they were also not able to achieve the desired results, as this kind of a parity or a lot of inequality existed in the society. So we find that how these kind of problems which were encountered during this period, they had to be undertaken by the people, those who were controlling the government or those who were making the policies. And how to consolidate the nation was one of the issues in those times, given the kind of diversity of India and the kind of problems which they were there at that point of time with regard to the language, or with regard to the regions, or with regard to the religion. All these kinds of issues, they were important at that point of time, and how to take the independent and planned development at that point of time. And in this we find that the planning commission and the planning processes, where planning processes were important, and how the 5-year plans, they were being initiated, and there was a lot of money was earmarked for the educational development and for other kinds of scientific and technological developments as well. So we find that India at that point of time also followed some kind of an innovative foreign policy, where they could seek the kind of support from different countries at that point of time, and the initiation of the electoral process was also such where the democracy was rooted, and how the different organs of the government, how they got involved in setting up of those kinds of policies, where educational and other kinds of developments could also take place. So we find that the developments in the science and technology took some kind of wings during 50s, 60s and thereafter as well, and all this had to be done in a setup where the issue of welfare state was also very, very important. And when we talk about the education, we see that education is an instrument of social change and economic progress, and it also provides opportunities to the people, so that people become equal in the society, because education will provide them opportunities and their mobility will increase, and because of which we find that in 1951 it was very, very important, because only 16.6% of the total population was literate, and it was much lower in the case of the rural families. And similarly was the case of the women, where women, they were not all that educated when they were being compared with men. So the challenge with the government was to increase these kinds of educational opportunities, where both men and women, young boys and girls, both of them, they could be educated. And one of the tasks was to provide free and compulsory education to every child up to the age of 14, and the constitution directed that by 1961 this could be achieved, and later this target was revised to 1966. And we find that when India became independent at that point of time, Central Advisory Board of Education, it decided in January 1948 to set up two commissions. One was to deal with the university education, and other was to deal with the secondary education, recognizing the fact that the requirements of independent India would be different, and hence restructuring of the system was imminent. And there was a lot of focus in terms, as I told you, in the context of providing the free and compulsory education up to the age of 14, and it was also being debated in the Constituent Assembly earlier, and it found expression in the directive principles of the state policy, and thereafter how it was being it was to be achieved by 1961, and thereafter shifted to 1966. So we find that the focus on education was an important concern for the people, those who were making the constitution, and they realized the importance of education, that when they will create such kind of schemes where school as well as university education would be provided to the people, then India would definitely be on the path of development and growth. and they also were talking about not only the elementary education, not only the university education, but at the same time they were also talking in the framework of the technical education which was to be provided, so that more and more people they become skillful and can in a way become partners in the development of India, and at the same time in the growth of per capita income and the national income. And we also find that in 1948 University Education Commission was formed to report on the Indian university education and to suggest some kind of improvement and extensions so that the future requirements of the country could be met. And Dr. Radhakrishnan was the chairman of this commission, and the task was in the context of reorienting the education system to face the great problem, national and social, the acquisition of the economic independence, increase of general prosperity, the attainment of an effective democracy overriding distinctions of caste and creed, rich and poor, and a rise in level of culture. So it had varied kind of responsibilities, so that the education system should be reoriented in such a manner that the objectives of India in terms of economic independence and the development they could be achieved. And we also it had also to keep in mind the kind of distinctions which were there in the society on the basis of caste and creed, in terms of the classes, the rich and the poor. And so the commission talked about that how the system with regard to education had to be reoriented so that the aims could be achieved in an efficient manner. And it was also to be seen in the framework of the constitution, where democracy, justice, liberty, equality and fraternity, all these kinds of aspects, they had also to be taken care of. And the education system was also be remolded in such a manner that the aspirations of the people, they are also fulfilled. And on the question of the economic independence, the report noted the urgent need of the technicians, that there is an urgent need for such occupations and skills all over the country, which will train a large and growing body of ambitious youth for employment as technicians in the various existing industries. And this will provide some sort of a flow to the skilled workers in the several modern industries, and it was one of the important tasks, and for that the later training would be provided to them. The commission also felt that a strong body like University Grants Commission should be set up, which should be an autonomous body, and it would organize the governance of the universities, and it had to be autonomous in nature. But when the education policy resolution came up before the parliament, then the government accepted the proposal of establishing the UGC, but ruled that it shall function under the authority of the Ministry of Education. So the idea of giving autonomy to UGC was not taken up by the government at that point of time, and though it was established, but it would function under the authority of Ministry of Education. That was being decided at that point of time. And later other commissions were also established, like Dr. D.S. Kothari commission was also established. It was the Education Commission which was appointed in 1964, and the report was in the context of the social and political expression of the economic crisis of that period. And the commission recommended that, and its recommendations, when one looks at the recommendations which were given by the commission, so they reflected the democratic aspirations of the Indian people for free and compulsory education and increased financial outlay as well, because unless the financial outlay will be increased, then the more and more people they cannot be provided education. In India being a poor country where more people were illiterate at that point of time, increasing the budget of the education sector will provide opportunities for the people, so that they could become partners not only for their own growth, but at the same time for the growth of the country as well. and we find that the government decided to provide a lot of support to the education, and expenditures they were being increased during this period, as you can see the data as well, which is on the screen, that how expenditure on education was rupees 198 million in 1952-53, and by 1964-65 it had increased to rupees 1462.7 million. So we find that this kind of a jump, which was nearly 7 times, it took place during this period. And we also find that how in the states also there was a lot of focus on the primary education, and education was primarily a state subject. So there was a lot of urging by the Prime Minister, so that the states, they should not lag behind, and they should provide all sorts of facilities to the people in the states. And we find that between 1951 and 1961 school enrollment, it doubled for the boys and it tripled for the girls. So more and more students they entered the school system. But one of the major problems we also find in the later times was in the context of the dropout rate, that how so many people, those who took admissions in the schools and later they became dropouts, and this was one of the major problems in the recent times as well, not only at that point of time. And we find that when India became independent, there were only 18 universities, and by 1964 the number of universities they increased to 54, and the number of colleges to about 2,500, and the postgraduate and undergraduate students to 6,13,000, and the number of girls students they increased sixfold and constituted 22% of the total. So we find that there was a lot of focus in terms of providing education to both girls and boys, and the number of students, those who were engaged in the studies, it also increases as the data given by Bipin Chandra. And we find that the constitution was also focusing in terms of providing free and compulsory education to the people, and at the same time there were a lot of problems as well, that the facilities which were there in the schools, they were very, very poor, and we find that many of the schools, they did not have any pakka building, and there was shortage of blackboards or drinking water. Toilet facility was also not there in the schools, which became some kind of an impediment for the girls students, and nearly 40% of the primary schools had only one teacher to take 3 to 4 classes. So these kinds of problems, where shortage of teachers or absenteeism of teachers or lack of infrastructure in terms of blackboards or benches and tables and drinking water and toilet facilities, these were some of the problems. And we were also talking in the framework of the dropout rate, and how in the later times we find that midday meal scheme was launched by the government at different levels, so that the parents, they do not have to come to their own home. The working parents, they do not have to come to their home so to feed the kid, and there will be also some sort of an incentive for the poorer parents, that kids, they will get food in their school. So all these kinds of things they were also being promoted in the later times, but at that point of time we find that there was a lot of dropout rate, and it was more in the context of girls. And we also find that there were no equal opportunity in education for the people. Those who had money, they could take admissions in the private schools, but in the government schools we find that there was no equal opportunity for the people. And another problem with regard to the educational system was the decline in the educational standards, that how the educational standards they were not being met, and especially in the technology sector, education system was left untouched, and not many reforms were carried out by the British. and we find that various colleges and universities, they deteriorated over a period of time, and there was some problem with regard to the ideological content of the education as well. And because the Macaulayan system of education, it continued, and there was a lot of focus on the rote learning. So these were some of the problems which were there at that point of time. And we find that when one talks about the education system, one has to understand that there was a lot of problem with regard to the colonial rule, and how the economic drain of wealth from India played an important role in terms of the overall backwardness of India in different sectors, and education was another important sector where no kind of growth was made, because British wanted that the Indians, they should be trained in such a way that they become some sort of clerks in the lower administrative levels for them, and that is how they focus a lot on the English education. And they consider that the indigenous education of the Indians was not worthy of any kind of improvement, and people like Macaulay, they felt that how if you see the libraries of across the world, only one shelf of the library of a West will have all the literatures of the East. So they had this kind of a biased attitude and this kind of a racial attitude towards the Indian, and in such a situation it would be very, very difficult to make any kind of a growth in the educational sector. But despite that, we find that the people, those who were associated with the national movement, they felt that there was some kind of a desire or need to carry on the development in the educational sector as well. And some Indians, though they were taught in English, and how English became some sort of a link language during the colonial period, where the freedom fighters, they could also converse in English, those who were from the different regions of the country, and they were speaking the different languages. So this handicap of imposing the English was used by the people, those who were associated with the national movement, so as to garner the support for the national movement, how English was being used to provide the kind of information to the other areas. And all these kinds of challenges which were there at that point of time were taken up, and when India became independent in 1947, the newly elected government was also keen to reform the kind of system which was there, and it also realized at that point of time that once they will provide some kind of an impetus to the educational reforms, in the sense that they will provide money to the educational sector. And when during the planning process and during the 5-year plans, we find that money was being provided to the educational sector, and at the same time we also find that various institutions which were dealing with the in the context of growth in the educational sector, where the technological and scientific education could also be provided to the Indians. So we find that all these kinds of developments, they take place during this period, and the issues relating to the science and technological developments will be taken up in the next lecture. Thank you very much.